One day they are everywhere. Their name is on every headline, their face on every screen, their voice shaping the decisions of nations, industries, empires. And then, almost overnight, they vanish, not killed, not always disgraced, just gone. Quietly erased from the rooms they once dominated, from the conversations they once controlled, from the future they thought belonged to them. History is littered with these ghosts. Kings who ruled absolutely and died forgotten in exile. Executives who built empires and were escorted out of their own boardrooms. Revolutionaries who overthrew tyrants only to be devoured by the very system they created. Movie stars, moguls, generals, dictators. The pattern repeats with chilling consistency. This is not bad luck. This is not simply falling from grace. This is a law, an old, unforgiving law of power that governs every human hierarchy that has ever existed. The moment you rise high enough to be seen by everyone, you become visible to everyone who wants to take your place. Power does not just attract admiration, it attracts hunters. Robert Greene spent his career studying exactly this phenomenon, dissecting the rise and fall of tyrants, strategists, and titans across 3,000 years of recorded history. And buried inside his work is one of the darkest, least comfortable truths about ambition. The very qualities that make you powerful are often the same qualities that guarantee your disappearance. In the next few minutes, we are going to walk through the mechanics of this vanishing act, the invisible forces, the psychological traps, and the silent wars that swallow the powerful whole. Because if you understand why they disappear, you gain something most people never get, a chance to see it coming before it happens to you. There is a peculiar irony sitting at the center of every ambitious life. We are taught from childhood that success means being seen, get noticed, stand out, rise above the crowd. And so we spend years, sometimes decades, clawing our way into visibility, believing that the spotlight is the reward. What almost nobody tells you is that the spotlight is also the trap. Every hierarchy, whether it's a royal court, a corporation, a political party, or a criminal syndicate, operates on a brutal, unspoken arithmetic. There is only so much room at the top. For every person who rises, someone else does not. And human beings, for all their sophistication, have never stopped keeping score. The moment you become visible, truly visible, the kind of visible where your name is spoken in rooms you're not in, you stop being just a person. You become a reference point, a measuring stick, a target. This is the first and most overlooked reason powerful people disappear. They forget that visibility is not a finish line. It is the starting gun for a much more dangerous race. The race to survive everyone who now has a motive to see you fall. Consider how power actually operates beneath the surface of every organization. On the surface, there are titles, org charts, public statements of unity, ceremonial smiles at company dinners. Underneath, there is a second unofficial hierarchy built on envy, resentment, unspoken debts, old grudges, and quiet alliances. This second hierarchy is where the real decisions about your fate are made, and the tragedy is that most powerful people never bother to study it because they are too busy managing the first one, the visible one, believing that competence and results are enough to keep them safe. They are not throughout history. The people who fell hardest were rarely the incompetent ones. In fact, competence often accelerated their downfall because it made them threatening. A mediocre rival is easy to tolerate. A brilliant one is not. The moment your talent becomes undeniable, you have unknowingly recruited an army of quiet enemies. People who will never say a critical word to your face, who will smile and congratulate you at every turn, all while calculating patiently the exact moment your usefulness runs out. This is the paradox Greene returns to again and again in his study of power. The higher you climb, the less honest feedback you receive, and the more your fall is engineered by people whose smiles you mistook for loyalty. Think about the courts of old European monarchies. A king's most dangerous enemy was rarely a foreign army. It was the nobleman standing 2 feet away, bowing at every command, waiting sometimes for years for the smallest crack in the king's authority. Advisors who had climbed for decades to reach the inner circle would vanish within months of a single miscalculation, a single moment where they appeared too confident, too independent, too untouchable. The court did not tolerate untouchable people. It systematically, patiently dismantled them. The same pattern plays out today in boardrooms, in political parties, in Hollywood studios, in Silicon Valley. The executive who seems unstoppable one quarter is often gone within the year, not because the market turned, not because they lost their skill, but because somewhere along the way, they became too visible, too dominant, too much of a singular point of power in a system that instinctively resists any single point of power lasting too long. There is a reason for this instinct, and it isn't petty jealousy, although jealousy plays its part. It's structural. Every system of power, whether ancient or modern, has a kind of biological memory of what happens when one figure accumulates too much control. It becomes fragile, a single point of failure. Remove that one person through death, scandal, or a well-timed betrayal, and the entire structure can collapse. So the system, almost as if it were alive, begins quietly working to prevent any one figure from becoming permanently indispensable. It elevates rivals, it plants doubts, it waits for weakness. This is what makes the disappearance of powerful people so shocking to outside observers, and so inevitable to those who understand the mechanics underneath. From the outside, it looks sudden. A scandal breaks. A resignation is announced. A coup takes place overnight. But from the inside, the process was almost always slow, deliberate, and years in the making. The rivals had been positioning. The resentments had been accumulating. The alliances against the powerful figure had been quietly forming long before the public ever caught a whiff of trouble. The lesson embedded here is uncomfortable, but essential. Visibility without vigilance is a death sentence. The moment you stop watching the shadows because you're too dazzled by your own spotlight, you have already started the countdown on your own disappearance. Power is never static. It is a living, breathing contest. And the people who last are not necessarily the most talented. They are the ones who never forget that being seen means being hunted. If visibility is the trap that catches powerful people from the outside, certainty is the poison that destroys them from within. There is a specific, well-documented psychological shift that happens to almost everyone who accumulates significant power, and it is so consistent across history that it might as well be a law of nature. In the early stages of a rise to power, people are hungry, alert, paranoid in the productive sense, constantly scanning for threats, constantly questioning their own decisions, constantly aware of how fragile their position really is. This state of heightened awareness, uncomfortable as it is precisely what allows them to succeed. It keeps them sharp. It keeps them humble enough to listen, adaptable enough to change course, and cautious enough to avoid the obvious traps. But success has a cruel side effect. The more it accumulates, the more it insulates. And the more it insulates, the more the very instincts that built it begin to atrophy. This is the slow poison of certainty, the gradual, almost invisible transformation from a hungry outsider who questions everything into a comfortable insider who questions nothing. It rarely happens all at once. It happens through 1,000 small moments of validation. The applause that grows louder, the yes men who multiply, the advisors who learn it's safer to agree than to challenge, the mirrors that only ever seem to reflect greatness back. Robert Greene's study of history's great falls consistently points to this same mechanism. The tyrant who once carefully cultivated alliances becomes the tyrant who assumes loyalty is owed rather than earned. The strategist who once meticulously studied their enemies becomes the strategist who assumes the enemy has already been defeated. The visionary who once obsessively tested their own assumptions becomes the visionary who treats their own opinions as unquestionable fact. This shift is dangerous precisely because it doesn't feel like decline. It feels like confidence. It feels like mastery. The person at the center of it often believes they have simply arrived. that the uncertainty of earlier years was a phase to be outgrown rather than a discipline to be maintained. But what they have actually lost is the single most valuable asset that got them to the top in the first place: the willingness to see reality clearly, even when reality is unflattering. Consider how many empires, corporations, and political movements have collapsed not because of an external shock they couldn't have predicted, but because of warnings they received and dismissed. The advisor who raised a concern was seen as disloyal rather than useful. The employee who pointed out a flaw was quietly sidelined rather than promoted. The journalist who asked an uncomfortable question was dismissed as biased rather than engaged. Each of these moments individually seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a wall between the powerful figure and the truth, a wall built ironically by the very success that was supposed to protect them. There is a particular danger zone here worth naming directly: the moment when a powerful person begins to believe their position is permanent. This belief is almost never stated out loud. It would sound absurd if spoken plainly, but it shows up in behavior. It shows up in the refusal to build new alliances because the old ones seem sufficient. It shows up in the neglect of succession planning because stepping aside feels unthinkable. It shows up in the dismissal of emerging rivals because they seem too small, too new, too unproven to be a real threat. History is merciless toward this particular blind spot. The rivals who eventually topple the powerful are almost never the ones already recognized as dangerous. Those are watched, managed, neutralized. It is the ones dismissed as insignificant who do the real damage, precisely because they were never taken seriously enough to be guarded against. The advisor everyone underestimated, the junior partner everyone overlooked, the quiet colleague who seemed too mild to be ambitious. By the time their ambition becomes undeniable, they have often already built the alliances, gathered the information, and positioned themselves close enough to strike. There's also a subtler, more intimate version of this poison: the way certainty corrodes personal relationships at the top. Powerful people often begin to mistake flattery for loyalty and silence for agreement. They surround themselves, whether consciously or not, with people who make them feel good rather than people who make them think clearly. This is deeply human. Nobody enjoys being challenged, especially after years of hard-won success, but it is also profoundly dangerous because it strips away the early warning system that once protected them. When everyone around you is nodding, you have no way of knowing when you've made a catastrophic error until the consequences are already unfolding in public. What makes this particular trap so dark, so worthy of being called Greene's darkest lesson, is that it cannot be avoided through intelligence or talent alone. Some of the most brilliant minds in history fell into exactly this pattern, not because they lacked the capacity to see it coming, but because the psychological pull toward comfort, validation, and certainty is simply that strong. It affects kings and CEOs, generals and celebrities, revolutionaries and reformers alike. It is, in a very real sense, the tax that power charges on the mind of everyone who holds it. The only defense, and it is a fragile one, is a kind of deliberate, disciplined humility. The willingness to keep asking uncomfortable questions long after the applause has started, to keep testing your assumptions long after you've been proven right, and to keep treating your position as something that must be defended every single day, rather than something you have permanently earned. Those who manage to maintain this discipline are rare. Those who don't are the ones who, one day without warning to the outside world, simply disappear. If certainty is the enemy within, then the coalition of the overlooked is the enemy without, and it is by far the most underestimated force in the collapse of powerful people. Here is the uncomfortable truth Greene's work circles back to repeatedly: no one falls alone. Behind almost every sudden downfall in history, there is a quiet alliance that formed long before the public ever noticed anything was wrong. This alliance is rarely made up of obvious enemies. It is made up of the people the powerful figure never bothered to fear: the assistant who felt disrespected, the junior executive who was passed over for promotion, the partner who felt used rather than valued, the ally who was humiliated once in private and never forgot it. Individually, none of these people pose a threat. This is exactly why they are so dangerous collectively. Power, when it grows large enough, inevitably steps on people along the way, sometimes deliberately, more often carelessly, through simple neglect or thoughtlessness. Each of these small humiliations plants a seed. And seeds, given enough time and the right conditions, grow into something far more organized than a single grudge. This is how coalitions form. Not through dramatic betrayal, but through the slow accumulation of shared resentment. Two overlooked people discover in a private conversation that they've had a similar experience with the same powerful figure. That conversation leads to another. Trust builds. A plan, however loose at first, begins to take shape. And because none of these individuals were ever seen as threats, none of them were ever watched, managed, or placated the way an obvious rival would have been. By the time the powerful figure realizes what's happening, the coalition is often already strong enough to act. And the fall, when it comes, looks sudden to everyone watching from the outside. It is not sudden. It is the final, visible stage of a process that may have been building for years. This is why Greene places such enormous emphasis throughout his study of power on the treatment of those beneath you, not out of pure ethical concern, though ethics certainly matter, but as a matter of cold strategic survival. Every person you dismiss, humiliate, or take for granted is a potential node in a future coalition against you. Every alliance you fail to nurture is territory you are ceding to someone else who will nurture it instead. Power is never held in isolation. It is held through a web of relationships, and every neglected thread in that web is a place where the web can eventually be torn apart. There's a particular irony worth sitting with here. The more powerful someone becomes, the more they tend to treat relationships as transactional rather than reciprocal. The people around them start to feel less like partners and more like tools, useful only for what they can provide in the moment. This shift often happens gradually and unconsciously. Few powerful people would ever admit, even to themselves, that they've stopped valuing the people around them as people. But the people on the receiving end feel it acutely. They notice when their contributions go unacknowledged. They notice when their concerns go unheard. They notice when they are replaced without a second thought, the moment they're no longer maximally useful. And they remember. This is why some of history's most dramatic downfalls involved betrayal from the least expected quarters. The loyal lieutenant who finally had enough, the trusted advisor who felt discarded once too often, the closest ally who realized, after years of being taken for granted, that their loyalty had never been reciprocated. These are not stories of sudden treachery. They are stories of patience finally running out. There's also a broader, more structural version of this coalition building that operates at the level of entire systems rather than individuals. In corporate environments, this might look like a slow alignment among mid-level managers who feel the leadership has lost touch with the realities of the business. In political systems, it might look like a gradual coalition of interest groups who feel systematically excluded from decision-making. In creative industries, it might look like collaborators who feel their contributions have been erased or undervalued by a dominant figure who claims sole credit. In every case, the mechanism is the same. Neglect breeds resentment. Resentment breeds alliance. And alliance eventually breeds consequence. The powerful figures who avoid this fate, and there are some, though they are rare, tend to share a specific discipline. They treat the maintenance of relationships as an active, ongoing responsibility rather than a passive byproduct of success. They remember names. They acknowledge contributions, even small ones, especially from people who have no obvious power to reward or punish them. They resist the temptation to burn bridges simply because a person no longer seems useful in the moment. And critically, they stay alert to the early signs of resentment, a colleague who's grown quiet, an ally who's stopped offering opinions, a subordinate who started keeping their distance, because these small behavioral shifts are often the first visible symptoms of a coalition beginning to take shape beneath the surface. This is, in many ways, the most preventable of all the forces that cause powerful people to disappear. Unlike the impersonal machinery of visibility and rivalry, this one is entirely within an individual's control. It doesn't require political genius or extraordinary vigilance. It requires only the discipline to treat people well, consistently, especially when there's no immediate incentive to do so. And yet history shows, again and again, that this simple discipline is one of the hardest for the powerful to maintain, precisely because power itself so often erodes the humility required to practice it. By the time a powerful figure actually disappears, resigns, is ousted, fades from relevance, or falls in outright disgrace, the event itself is almost always the smallest part of the story. What precedes it is a long, largely invisible architecture, carefully constructed by people with both the patience and the incentive to see the powerful figure removed. This is one of the least understood aspects of how power collapses. It is rarely a single dramatic confrontation. It is a sequence of small, deniable moves, each one designed to weaken the target's position just enough to make the final blow look inevitable, natural, even deserved. The first stage of this architecture is almost always narrative control. Long before any formal action is taken, a quiet shift begins in how the powerful figure is discussed. In private conversations, in hallway asides, in carefully worded emails that will later look prescient rather than orchestrated. The story starts to change. Where once the figure was described as visionary, whispers begin describing them as reckless. Where once they were seen as decisive, they begin to be described as controlling. None of these shifts happen through direct confrontation. They happen through suggestion, repetition, and the careful cultivation of doubt among people who matter. This is a crucial point. Those working to remove a powerful figure rarely attack their strengths directly, because direct attacks invite direct defense. Instead, they reframe those same strengths as liabilities. The confidence that once inspired followers is recast as arrogance. The boldness that once drove results is recast as recklessness. The independence that once seemed like strength is recast as an unwillingness to be held accountable. The genius of this approach is that it requires no lies, only a shift in framing, applied patiently over time, until the same set of facts tells a completely different story. The second stage involves the quiet cultivation of alternatives. No coalition moves against a powerful figure without first having some plan for what comes after. This might mean grooming a successor, positioning a rival favorably, or simply creating enough uncertainty that the organization or system becomes comfortable with the idea of change. This stage often unfolds in parallel with the narrative shift, and it is why sudden downfalls so rarely leave a genuine power vacuum, because by the time the powerful figure actually falls, someone else is almost always ready, conveniently, to step into the space they leave behind. The third stage is the search for a precipitating event, a scandal, a mistake, a public misstep that can serve as the official justification for removal. It's worth noting that this event is very rarely the actual cause of the downfall. It is the trigger, not the root. The root causes eroded trust, accumulated resentment, a shifting narrative, a ready alternative were already in place well before the triggering event occurred. This is why outside observers are so often baffled by the apparent disproportion between the offense and the consequence. A single email, a single public comment, a single financial miscalculation seems to bring down someone who has weathered far larger controversies in the past. The event itself was never really the point. It was simply the spark that ignited kindling that had been accumulating for a long time. Understanding this architecture reveals something important about how power actually erodes. By the time the exit becomes visible, it is already too late to prevent it. The real battle was lost months or years earlier, in all the small moments where narrative control shifted, alliances quietly reformed, and alternatives were patiently cultivated. Moments the powerful figure, blinded by the certainty discussed earlier, likely never even noticed. There is a chilling symmetry here worth naming directly. The very mechanisms a powerful figure once used to rise. Cultivating a favorable narrative, building strategic alliances, positioning themselves as indispensable, waiting patiently for the right moment to act, are the exact same mechanisms eventually used against them. Power does not just create the conditions for its own use. It creates a permanent, self-replicating playbook for its own removal, available to anyone patient and observant enough to study how it was originally built. This is perhaps the darkest layer of the lesson. Those who disappear from power are very often undone by a near-perfect mirror of the same strategy they once used to ascend. The tactics do not change. Only the direction does. For anyone paying close attention, there are usually visible symptoms of this architecture forming, if you know what to look for. A subtle change in tone from allies who once spoke with total confidence. A gradual reduction in access to information that once flowed freely. A growing pattern of decisions being made without consultation, or meetings happening that were once automatic invitations. A quiet increase in scrutiny over past decisions, framed as routine review rather than investigation. Individually, these signals are easy to dismiss, attributed to busyness, bureaucracy, or simple coincidence. Collectively, they are the unmistakable scaffolding of an exit already being constructed. The tragedy, of course, is that by the time these signals become undeniable, the coalition behind them typically has enough momentum that reversal is extraordinarily difficult. This is why the earlier lessons matter so much: the vigilance against certainty, the careful maintenance of relationships, the awareness that visibility invites hunters. These are not separate lessons. They are all defenses against the same slow, patient architecture of removal that eventually claims almost everyone who rises high enough to become worth removing. There is one final ingredient that transforms a survivable crisis into a total disappearance, and it is perhaps the most self-inflicted of all the forces discussed so far: the refusal to adapt once the warning signs are unmistakable. Almost every dramatic fall from power includes a moment, sometimes months before the actual collapse, sometimes mere weeks, where the writing on the wall becomes clear enough that a different response could plausibly have changed the outcome. A shift in strategy, an honest reckoning with mistakes, a willingness to share power, apologize, or step back temporarily rather than dig in, and yet, with striking consistency, the powerful figure chooses instead to double down. This pattern is so common across history that it deserves to be understood as a distinct and predictable phase separate from the certainty discussed earlier. Certainty is the quiet, gradual erosion of judgment that happens during the rise. This final refusal is different. It is what happens when someone, confronted directly with clear evidence that their position is collapsing, still cannot bring themselves to change course. Why does this happen with such consistency? Part of the answer lies in identity. For people who have spent years, sometimes decades, building their sense of self around a particular role or level of power, the prospect of losing that position isn't just a professional setback. It can feel like an existential threat, a kind of death of the self they've come to know. Adapting in this frame doesn't feel like a strategic pivot. It feels like an admission that the entire identity was built on something false or fragile. And so, rather than face that psychological reckoning, many powerful people choose instead to fight harder, cling tighter, and deny more forcefully, even when every external signal suggests this is precisely the wrong response. There is also a structural reason this pattern repeats. The very skills that built someone's power in the first place, decisiveness, conviction, the ability to push through resistance, are often the exact skills that make retreat feel unnatural, even shameful. A person who has spent their entire career being rewarded for pushing forward has rarely developed the muscle for graceful withdrawal. They know how to fight. They do not know how to fold. And in moments where folding, strategically, temporarily, might have preserved far more than fighting ever could, They default to the only playbook they've ever known. History offers countless examples of leaders, executives, and public figures who had genuine opportunities to change course and chose instead to escalate. The apology that could have diffused a scandal instead becomes a defiant denial. The strategic retreat that could have preserved long-term position instead becomes a stubborn last stand. The quiet handoff of power that could have secured a dignified legacy instead becomes a public humiliating removal. In nearly every case, the difference between survival and disappearance came down not to the severity of the original crisis, but to the response chosen once the crisis became undeniable. This refusal to adapt is deeply connected to something Greene's broader body of work returns to constantly: the danger of rigid self-image. The more tightly someone's identity is bound to a specific role, title, or level of dominance, the more catastrophic any threat to that role will feel, and the more irrationally they will fight to preserve it, even at the cost of their long-term interests. Ironically, the people who prove most resilient in the face of a genuine power crisis are often those who have maintained some psychological distance from their role all along, who understand, even at the height of their power, that their position is a temporary arrangement rather than a permanent fact of their identity. There's a further layer of tragedy here. The refusal to adapt doesn't just fail to prevent the fall, it very often accelerates it and makes it far more public and humiliating than it needed to be. A quiet, early acknowledgement of a mistake might have contained a scandal to a small circle of insiders. A defiant refusal to acknowledge anything turns that same scandal into a prolonged public spectacle, drawing in more scrutiny drawing in more critics drawing in more evidence, until what could have been a manageable setback becomes an unrecoverable collapse. This is, in many ways, the final and darkest twist of Greene's lesson. Powerful people frequently possess every piece of information they need to save themselves. They see the shifting alliances. They hear the changing narrative. They notice the declining access, the closed-door meetings, the sudden scrutiny. The information is rarely hidden from them entirely. What fails is not their intelligence. It is their willingness to act on what that intelligence is telling them, because acting on it would require confronting an identity crisis most are simply unwilling to face until it's forced upon them by total collapse. Those rare figures in history who have managed to step back from power gracefully, who read the signs early, adapted their position, shared or transferred power on their own terms rather than having it stripped from them, are remembered very differently than those who fought to the bitter end. Their names tend to be associated with wisdom rather than downfall, foresight rather than denial, and yet they remain the exception, not the rule, precisely because the psychological cost of stepping back voluntarily is so much harder to pay than the cost of simply refusing to see what's coming. We began with a simple, unsettling observation. Powerful people disappear, often suddenly, often without any warning visible to the outside world. By now, the pattern should look far less mysterious and far more mechanical, a series of forces that, once understood, explain almost every dramatic fall in recorded history. It starts with visibility. The moment someone rises high enough to be seen by everyone, they simultaneously become a target for everyone with a motive to see them fall. It deepens through certainty, the slow, comfortable erosion of the very vigilance and humility that built their success in the first place. It's compounded by the coalition of the overlooked, the quiet alliance of people who were dismissed, humiliated, or taken for granted along the way, patiently waiting for the moment their collective grievance becomes powerful enough to act. It's engineered through the architecture of a staged exit. The narrative shifts, the cultivated alternatives, the precipitating event that finally makes the removal look inevitable to onlookers who never saw the years of groundwork beneath it. And it's sealed almost always by a final refusal to adapt, the stubborn insistence on fighting rather than adjusting, even when every signal points toward a different path. None of these forces operate in isolation. They build on each other, feed each other, and accelerate each other, which is precisely why the eventual disappearance so often looks sudden from the outside while feeling, to those who understand the mechanics, like the only possible ending to a story that had been writing itself for years. So what, if anything, can be done? Is this simply the unavoidable fate of anyone who climbs high enough, a kind of gravity that eventually pulls every powerful figure back down? Not entirely. History does offer a small number of counterexamples. People who held significant power for extended periods, weathered serious threats to their position, and either maintained their influence or stepped away from it on their own terms, rather than having it stripped from them. What distinguishes these rare figures is not that they avoided power's dangers entirely, no one truly does, but that they built specific deliberate habits to counteract each of the forces described above. Against visibility, they maintained genuine vigilance rather than complacent confidence, treating every position of prominence as inherently contested rather than permanently secured, and continuing to study the shifting landscape of allies and rivals long after their positions seemed unassailable. Against certainty, they deliberately cultivated dissenting voices rather than surrounding themselves exclusively with validation, seeking out people willing to challenge their assumptions and treating uncomfortable feedback as a resource rather than a threat. Against the coalition of the overlooked, they practiced a consistent, almost disciplined generosity toward those with little power to reward or punish them, remembering that every relationship, however small it seems in the moment, is a thread in the web that either supports or eventually unravels their position. Against the architecture of a staged exit, they stayed closely attuned to shifts in narrative and access, noticing and responding to the early and easily dismissed signals of eroding support long before those signals became undeniable. And against the final refusal to adapt, they maintained enough psychological distance from their role to recognize when the wisest move was not to fight, but to adjust, to share power, or to step back, understanding at some deep level that identity and position are not the same thing, and that survival often depends on being willing to let go of the second in order to preserve something of lasting value beyond it. This is, in the end, the darkest and most valuable lesson buried inside the long history of powerful people who vanished. Not a warning to avoid power altogether, but a demand for a very specific kind of discipline once power is achieved. The rules that got someone to the top are not the same rules that keep them there. Ambition, confidence, and decisiveness are essential for the climb. Vigilance, humility, generosity, and adaptability are essential for the descent to not happen on someone else's terms. Very few people manage to hold both sets of qualities simultaneously, which is precisely why the disappearance of the powerful remains such a consistent, almost inevitable pattern across every era of recorded history. It is not a flaw unique to any one culture, industry, or personality type. It is a structural feature of power itself. The same force that elevates people above the crowd is, without constant vigilance, the very thing that eventually ensures they don't stay there. The question worth sitting with, long after this video ends, is not simply why do powerful people disappear? It's a far more personal one. In your own rise, whatever form that rise takes, whatever field, whatever scale, are you building the kind of vigilance, humility, and adaptability that might let you avoid this fate? Or are you, like so many before you, already comfortable enough, certain enough, surrounded by enough agreement, that you wouldn't notice the architecture of your own vanishing point, even as it was quietly being built around you? History suggests the answer to that question is rarely obvious from the inside. It is only ever obvious in hindsight, which is exactly why understanding these patterns now before they apply to you is the only real advantage anyone ever gets.